Article 42.7 of the Treaty on European Union is a legally binding mutual defense clause. If a member of the European Union is subjected to armed aggression, the others are obliged to assist it by all means in their power. By all means in their power. In other words, by all means. They kick in unilaterally. That is, admitting a warring country into the European Union means taking on the obligation to fight for it. This isn't even Article 5 of the NATO agreement. I think it's even more specific and more binding. The only thing that's missing there is the United States of America. A country at war is being invited into an alliance whose charter includes the obligation to fight for each of its members. And this means, on the day Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, the entire European Union, by its own law, voluntarily, with its own signature, takes on the obligation to enter into war with Russia by all means at its disposal. The price tag for Ukraine, verified figures, not rumors. This is before accession, right? The European Union has already approved 90 billion and 30 billion euros, that is even more than dollars, for Ukraine's budget. Well, for Ukraine's budget, not for the war, and 60 billion for the war. The European Commission estimates the funding gap for 2026-2027 at about 136 billion, and the IMF at 137 billion. I want to tell you right away, whenever they estimate something, you should multiply it by 2, so it's probably around 250 to 300 billion euros. Now add it up. After breaking the resistance of several Eastern European countries who were unwilling to pay, especially Hungary, if you remember, the European Union decided to integrate Ukraine as a full member of its organization with all the resulting consequences. Integration will take time. Okay, let's see what this means. Actually, there's no better way to shake up Europe than to throw it into a war. Well, obviously, yes, you can solve several problems at once. First, after that, you'll never find out who stole how much. And you'll never be able to identify the mistakes that were made. Besides, you can also get rid of unnecessary elements. And here's the funny thing. For some, the unnecessary element is anyone who's against the Islamization of Europe, meaning the right-wingers. And for others, the unnecessary elements are precisely those very Muslims who have flooded Europe in huge numbers and are building states within states, so to speak, with their own laws, Sharia, and so on. Whoever is leading this movement toward joining the war, it's their chance to solve some of their problems in this interesting way. Because 2, 8, 14, 36 million people died there. Whoever cared about that? It's just a number, right? And 136 with 136. Who cared about that? Let's take a look. So, regarding the treaties of the European Union, as well as the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, well, many people look into A but don't look into B. Literally, what does it say there? If a member state becomes a victim of armed aggression on its territory, that is, someone has entered its territory aggressively, well, that's Russia, on the territory of Ukraine, right? The other member states of the European Union are obliged to provide it with help and assistance at all times, as I already said, by all means at their disposal. And this applies, well, as it is written there, in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, that is, they refer to it. Now you have to read the UN Charter to actually understand what they meant. That is, the Europeans legally tie their internal obligation to fight for each other to the global right to self-defense. Well, if it says global in the UN, then it's global. So, in Article 51, the UN gives the voluntary right to defend oneself. In Article 47.7 of the European Union, this becomes an automatic obligation to enter into war. Well, the right turns into a trap. They took and replaced what was written in the UN with something they liked more. Exactly at the moment when a warring party is admitted into the Union, they are obliged, well, it shall have an obligation, just to make it clear, right? They cannot and will not consider it. And by joining the warring side in an alliance, It immediately means taking on the obligation to help them by all means, wherever in the war. You understand that by accepting Ukraine into the European Union, the EU countries automatically become a party to the conflict, meaning they become part of World War III, just to make it clear, right? So that it could be called World War III. So it's not that its signs are impossible to see there, it's already happening. Gentlemen, this is World War III, and you probably think that they just haven't read their own charter, right? Why do they shout that under no circumstances should anything be done, God forbid, to start World War III, but then with their own hands they vote to start it themselves? We need to figure this out. Am I right about us? Let's try to figure this out because this is some kind of nonsense, right? I hope you understood what I said. The European Union is going to accept Ukraine, which is at war, into its union, which means that according to the Charter, there is an obligation to protect each other from any attack. Many times, the leaders of the European Union have said that Russia attacked Ukraine. So, joining the European Union, or the European Union getting involved in this situation, means war between Europe and Russia. Don't you think they've gone completely insane? Or is there something else going on here? Well, let's give it a try. Let's begin at the very start, and sort of with an event that doesn't have a direct connection to this globally catastrophic decision. Let's start with the so-called leaders of the Russian opposition. Well, the opposition in exile, I mean. Some left, some were kicked out, some had other reasons. Those who live off grants and donations. Some get money from the CIA, some from the Soros Foundation, some from the Ukrainian government, and sometimes even from Russia. So they had a falling out, as they say, not over food, but over alcohol. Suffering, then suffering.
Против узурпатора.
They accuse each other that the other side, or those sides, didn't suffer enough. Let me remind you that some of them are actually being paid by this very usurper for their rather comfortable existence. But you didn't suffer enough from him, or less than you supposedly should have. So, you were recruited? Yes, me too, but later. So you're impotent, right? For a long time, 3 years, and me? Pfft, only a year and a half. And so I claim that between the Kremlin, which doesn't leave foreign land, and a Parisian restaurant, that's where it all happened. Where the two opposition leaders had a falling out, and the office in Brussels, where they count other people's billions and don't care how many millions of people will die. The connection is not accidental, and today I will try to show you how it works from the inside and what all this is about, what they are all fighting for. In the next half hour, I will tell you, I will lay out for you 6 completely different news stories at first glance, and you will see with your own eyes that these are not 6 news stories. It's one thread, a thread that is either struggling or stretching, and so on. Let's start with the big picture, okay? The peace process between Russia and Ukraine is on pause. And this pause is of a special kind. Ukraine has done everything that was expected of it according to the textbook of diplomacy. She got to page 18, then to page 19, and started. She coordinated a document of 22 points with the European Union. She handed it over to the United States. She handed it over to the Kremlin along with a proposal. Let's finish. And in response, what is called a refusal in polite society is expressed much more briefly in untranslatable Russian. So basically they sent us away and so on. The Kremlin said, until we get what we want, we won't leave. And Ukraine said, until you leave and so on, yes. 2 peoples who, within living memory, were married in the same churches. They buried relatives in the same cemeteries. Now they can't even sit at the same table. And as they say, they won't even sit together in the same field to do this. Notice, I'm not saying they don't want peace. I'm saying they can't agree. That's different, and the distinction is crucial. Why can't they? Remember this question. We'll keep coming back to it again and again, like a chorus, because there's only one answer to it. And it's also the answer to everything else. By the way, all they need is to find a common enemy. Then they'll agree quickly. For instance, they may identify the Jews as an enemy. Beat the Jew, save Ukraine. This slogan will be understood by Russians as well. I think they'll figure it out pretty quickly, and in fact, they've already figured it out a long time ago. In the meantime, a simple prediction, and it's more cynical than I'd like. Most likely, nothing will change until November. I mean, until the American elections. Because for too many participants in this drama, the war is not a tragedy that needs to be stopped. War is a card. Sometimes in someone else's deck, which is played according to someone else's calendar. And the people who die on or because of this card, no one takes them into account in this calendar at all. Maybe only one red-haired madman sitting in the White House in Washington. That's what they call him, a madman, and they consider him a madman, including the fact that for some reason they don't understand, he wants to prevent more Ukrainians from being killed. Why does he care, right? They claim it's Ukraine's leaders and the killing isn't over. And in Russia, they say, why is he concerned about Russian women? Someone from Russia came here, died there. Why does he care? And they probably think there's some kind of interest involved. Because as capitalists, we don't do anything without some self-interest, right? But they don't understand what that interest is. That's why they also think he's crazy. Position.
Значит,
So the opposition could have taken a different approach. They could have come up with some constructive proposal, regarding Russia and Ukraine, right? The opposition came out and says, here we are united abroad. These fools can't agree with each other, but we are proposing this. But in reality, they have something completely different in mind. As soon as they come out with some kind of proposal, then some of them might start or stop receiving grants. That is, as soon as I define my position, someone will immediately stop paying me a grant because they'll say, is that what you want? And if you say this, then they'll tell you that. Absolutely not, right? But there are only a limited number of grants. If he gets a grant, then someone else won't. So it's very simple. Undermine, and undermine your competitor again. And never express your own opinion. Understood? You should say exactly what the grant provider wants to hear. And nothing else. What suggestions are there? What should we talk about? What suggestions? We need to make money. Just like Vladimir Vladimirovich said when he worked in the Lensovet. As the mayor's assistant, he personally told me that we need to make cash. People who seem to have everything to be together, a common enemy. A common enemy? For now, I don't mean a Jewish enemy. Yeah, a common trouble. Shared prison sentences in the past. So what? Gali Kasparov and Vladimir Karamurza. By the way, Kasparov, I think, hasn't been in prison, right? No, he hasn't been in prison. Two figures. And Abukov, maybe he did spend 2 weeks there for hooliganism. Two figures who, not so long ago, were simply placed side by side on a poster. They had a falling out. Well, for real, personally, to the point that Karamurza left the anti-war committee. Well, that's what he said to them. Not suggestions, they're making proposals. But they're arguing. He stated that he couldn't be in the same field or even the same restroom as Kasparov. By the way, I understand him well in that sense. Well, I won't play in the same sandbox because this boy's farts smell really nasty. Well, that's actually true. It's true, yeah. So, and according to the stories, it all started with a quarrel in a Paris restaurant where one reproached the other for not having served enough time. And it seems they didn't do it while drunk. Because, well, at least as I understand it, the world champion isn't much of a drinker. There. He just takes a sip and that's it. I don't know about Karamurza. I hope he drinks. After that, I want to say that neither of them has served enough time. By the way, let me remind you that Garrick, if he ever did any time, it was under house arrest at his mother's place. And it was his mother who put him there, not anyone else. Basically, not at all, in my opinion. Yeah, it's really good to live in this world. Think about this phrase. People united by the fight against tyranny are comparing themselves to each other. Who was oppressed more? It's like they're comparing medals. Does the previous one have more medals or does Suslov have more medals? The Russian service of the Moscow News, or Moscow Times, writes about this. Immigration is active and absolutely ineffective. That's a great phrase. Immigration is active and absolutely ineffective. They run around, and they don't do anything. Everyone's quarreled. Everyone accuses each other of selfishness, betrayal, and plain stealing of Western grants. Huh? Stealing? He stole a grant from me, right? And what's most unpleasant is that, as a rule, the accusations are fair. Let's do it one more time. Well, I'm angry I'm being a jerk. A jerk. I apologize. I just couldn't help myself. Let me say it again. They accuse each other fairly, and well, that's it. It's not just this couple. This probably applies to all the leaders I know from the so-called anti-Putin coalition, the opposition, whatever you want to call it. I don't know. They all know about each other that they're all traitors, every single one of them, and they're thieves of Western grants and nothing more. Except for how fast they can run and grab a grant, that's all. They don't do anything else at all. Gentlemen, when I say traitors, I don't mean traitors to Russia or the motherland. They're just traitors by nature. Part of this I'm saying based on what was written by the Moscow Times. Part of it comes from other publications. Some of it is also a bit from my own experience. And many other affiliated publications also wrote about this. Some of these publications, just like these grant recipients, are dependent on Soros, some on the CIA, and some on Putin. Yes. Oh, I forgot. There are some that depend on Zelensky as well. That's why they shout so loudly that they're independent. Jack London once wrote about this, right? Or Jack London. Yes. There, when a person shouts, "I'm very honest. Watch your wallets," if he repeats that every 30 seconds. Now, their independence mostly means using grant money to order champagne or to order prostitutes. Prostitutes. That's independence. It's either this or that. But in everything else, they're dependent. Because, and here I want you to hear me very clearly, most of them really serve an external agenda. They get paid, they speak. The one who pays changes. What they say changes. These are not fighters. These are voices for hire, like a dog that doesn't bark at strangers but barks on its owner's command, and it goes silent when the owner says, "Quiet." Well, it went silent right away. Well, remember the story, let's say, with Ilarionov, right? He easily did a double somersault, a twist in midair, literally in a second. And he started saying the exact opposite of what he used to say earlier, claiming that he had never changed his opinion at all. Never. No way. No. For what, I see, for what? And right away, he started bad-mouthing all those people he had called friends for the rest of his life. Well, I get it. After you sold out completely, that's not really a life anymore. That's something else. So he was right about the rest of his life, wasn't he? He was friends with them. And after his free life ended, they just became subjects he was told to bark at. Well, something like that. Do you think he's the only one like that, right? I just made him up because he came to mind. I can name 10 more last names. I think that, well, there are at least 1 or 2 more that you also know. And now put the 2 pictures together. Russia and Ukraine can't agree on peace. Kasparov and Kara-Murza can't agree on fighting a common enemy. At first glance, these stories seem completely different. No, let's go further. Why? Because none of them, neither those in Moscow nor in Kyiv, nor those hanging out in Europe and America, have a worldview. They have no foundation, or rather, no, not a worldview, a foundation. There is no answer to a question that is older than politics. What is good, really? What is evil? So I say, I defend this one, and I'll put it this way, one attacked the other. When Hitler fought Stalin, one attacked the other. So they don't know what's theirs and what's someone else's. Where is the line that shouldn't be crossed, no matter what? They have no principles. And where there are no principles, only 3 driving forces remain. Cash, money, power, and personal convenience, and everyone pulls in their own direction, like the swan, the crayfish, and, excuse my language, the pike. Not because you're right, but because it's warmer, more comfortable, more flattering to your ego. And you've been accepted into the society you wanted to join. And you absolutely don't want to be kicked out of that society, right? That's why there's not a single leader among them. A leader isn't the one holding the microphone. A leader is the one who has the map when there's fog all around. And these people don't have a map. They have a compass. Yes, they have a compass. But it always points to their own pocket, nothing else. It points wherever the pocket is. This is the perfect time to remember those we always talk about. Nikolai Berdyaev, Philosophy of Inequality, basically warned, when society loses its spiritual certainty, its vertical, it does not become freer. It falls apart into a struggle of egos. And in place of the individual, there remains a mass that fights with itself. Well, that's exactly what we are seeing now. Andrew Galamba spent his whole life proving that every person has primary property, his life, his thoughts, his will. And that civilization begins exactly at the moment when I acknowledge that someone else's property does not belong to me, but to him or her. I can't do anything with it because it is theirs. Hillel Haggadol, or so to speak, Hillel the Great Jewish philosopher from Babylon, said all of this in one line 100 years before Jesus Christ, which you know, do not do to others what is hateful to yourself, and what you wouldn't want him to do to you. There are different variations of this, although hateful is the closest translation from Hebrew, Aramaic. So the people I just described have neither Berdyaev's vertical, nor Galambas's principle, nor Hillel's rule. And that's why they're doomed to quarrels, not out of malice, no, just by their very nature. It's just their nature, you know, like that snake that bit the turtle while crossing the raging river. If you didn't steal from work, then you stole from your family. That's their main trait. Pull the devil's shadow onto yourself, because if you don't make it in time, your buddies will pull it away. Ukraine was promised membership in the European Union. A country at war is being invited to join a union whose charter states the obligation to fight for every member. Why? So let's go over this again. That means on the day Ukraine becomes a member of the European Union, by its own law, voluntarily, with its own signature, Europe takes on the obligation to go to war with Russia by all means at its disposal. Well, now let's get to the point. As they say, the answer was actually simple, that's all. When joining the European Union, a country signs the terms and conditions of restructuring specific industries. This is directly embedded in the Accession agreement, and that's exactly the reason for all this commotion. An example, so you don't think I'm just making this up. Protocol number 8 on the restructuring of the Polish steel industry. When did Poland join? Poland allowed temporary state support for the steel industry, but only on the condition that the program was tied to reducing production capacity in Poland to reducing production. In return for joining, the country agreed to reduce its steel production, as clearly stated in the agreement. Now the ban on state aid, Article 107. This means they finish off the industry even after joining, like the Polish shipyards in Gdynia and Szczecin. After joining, the state continued to support its shipyards with money out of habit. In November 2008, the European Commission declared this state support illegal. The shipyards were subject to the rules of the single market and were required to return the money with interest. That is, the shipyards' production facilities had to return the money they had long since spent on workers. Well, that system in Poland wasn't very well developed yet, right? Naturally, the shipyards couldn't return the money. Their assets were seized and sold off at market price. Who do you think bought them? Poland passed a special law on liquidation procedures. So, one of the largest shipbuilding industries in Eastern Europe was dismantled, much to the delight of competitors in Western Europe. Notice the mechanics. No one forced them to sign any competition. They simply forbade the state from helping this industry, which was still fledgling as it transitioned to the West. And without this support, it wouldn't have survived the competition with already established Western players. The result is the same, but legally everything looks very clean. Well, you did help, you used your own money, but we don't allow that, that's our law. So, basically you signed this law. Yes, we did. Another mechanism is the production cap. That's just wonderful. So you produce 100, but they tell you, no, you can't make more than 3. You ask, how come? They say, you can't make more than 3. Oh, you signed here. So when new members joined, they were assigned production quotas, that's what it's called. Well, let's say milk and sugar. So direct subsidies to farmers from the new countries were initially lower than those for the old ones. They were introduced gradually over 10 years. French farmers received the full subsidy rate, while Polish farmers received only a portion. Your farmer is told not to produce more than a certain amount of milk or sugar, while the Western farmer is told to produce freely. They're not telling him to produce as much as he wants. The EU doesn't force anyone to sign up for competition, they do it more elegantly. They embed in the accession agreement the obligation to cut capacities, then they prohibit the state from saving its own industry and set quotas. That's it. You say that Ukraine shouldn't guess at all. The process is already underway. Right during the war, even before any accession? Precedents from the past, answers so to speak, are already being applied. I'll break it down by the two strongest industries. So steel is an exact copy of the Polish scenario already in action. Ukraine has historically been one of the world leaders in metals. There's copper, Metinvest, Kryvyi and its main market is Europe. What are they doing with it right now? Ukraine is being barred from selling steel in Europe. Or rather, it's allowed, but only a little. No more than Brussels permits. Well, just a little. Ukrainian steel is being strangled by the same hands that promised to welcome you into the family and fight for you. Grain and agriculture. There was an open rebellion from Ukraine here, an agricultural superpower. Its strength was exactly what sparked the first real conflict between former friends. Cheap Ukrainian grain crashed the prices in the country. Neighboring countries, Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Bulgaria imposed bans. Bans on what? On the import of Ukrainian agricultural products. Polish farmers blocked 260 roads with tractors. In other words, it was impossible to get through. The conclusion about agricultural products is simple. The EU physically cannot allow Ukrainian rural producers in on equal terms. It would ruin both Western farmers and the budget. So it means Ukraine can be ruined, but Western countries can't. Why? Because Ukraine is new, and they'll give it a lot of money now to keep it quiet. So Ukraine faces many years of transitional periods, quotas, and reduced subsidies, just like the new members in 2004, only tougher. Why? Because Ukraine is bigger. Now it means the stronger the Ukrainian industry is, the more likely it will be pressured. If it was weak, they would let it in freely, since it's not a threat. But metals and grain, for example, and there's a lot more, are just too competitive. That's why they impose tariffs, quotas, and limits specifically on those. Ukraine is being invited into the house, but when it comes to the two rooms where it really matters, they're locking the doors. According to Article 48, I think it is, Europe is ready to commit to fighting for Ukraine, to shed blood for it, but not to let it into the market. Because if Ukrainian industry starts to compete locally, old Europe will be in trouble. So dying for the common market is fine, but making money in the common market, not a chance. We must defend, but they won't let us compete. If the EU had a single principle, it would be either a free market for everyone, then let Ukrainian metal and grain in, or protect your own, but then don't invite us into the Union to fight. It maintains both, based on the situation. The strong West uses market protection when profitable and shows solidarity when politically beneficial. There are no principles, only convenience. The Ukrainian will pay for this twice, with blood on the front lines and with a closed door to the market, the very market he was called to fight for. And here is my version, which is largely based on real facts. Accession means putting a cage of rules on Ukraine. Joining the EU means obligating the country to adopt 80,000 pages of regulations. A ban on state support, green regulations, labor and environmental standards, quotas, and this raises the cost of Ukrainian production to the European level. That is, it takes away the only weapon that a free, less regulated Ukraine could use to outperform Germany. Cheap energy, cheap skilled labor, and low regulation are a threat to the West. Real Germany is already feeling this. Germany is deindustrializing itself. Energy for industry is twice as expensive as in the US and 50% more expensive than in China. BASF is shutting down its plants. The model of cheap Russian gas plus expensive exports has collapsed. Production is shifting to areas with cheaper labor and fewer regulations. Now imagine a rebuilt Ukraine right next door. Nuclear energy, gas, titanium, lithium, rare earth elements, talented engineers, low wages, minimal regulation. Well, I don't even know what to call it. an American Mexico, an American America, who knows? A magnet that would suck out the remaining German and French industry, and they have plenty of elderly people who need to be taken care of. For Western manufacturers, this is a real fear, not just a fantasy. The American market alternative isn't made up. It's already on the table thanks to the U.S.-Ukraine agreement on minerals. It's specifically a market-based recovery mechanism, a fund based on private capital, the right of first refusal for American investors, and $150 million as a seed to mobilize private money. And lawyers explicitly point out a conflict with European Union rules. The right of first refusal for Americans contradicts the EU requirement for neutral and non-discriminatory market access. It's interesting, how will Ukraine now sign something that's directly opposite to what it signed with America? They had to include a clause in the text stating that the agreement does not contradict the obligations for joining the EU. So, in reality, two models of recovery are clashing. The American deal, private capital, deregulation, and the European regulation and control. But for that, they are ready to promise to fight the Europeans, but only with us, not with America, with us. Otherwise, we will go bankrupt. We will fight for you. We will give you a lot of money now, 100 billion. 100 to 150 billion, just don't compete with us. Joining the European Union is exactly the tool that puts this, cage of rules on Ukraine in advance and suppresses its competitive advantage, until the American market model turned it into a low-cost giant right at the border. You can't prove this intentionally. The result is obvious, and it's exactly as I told you. And here, one principle sounds like a verdict. If the EU truly believed in a free market, a strong Ukraine would be a gift. Cheap components, growth, competition, but they're stifling it. Really stifling it. So, in words, free market, but in reality, it's about protecting their own. From competition, from anything at all, it's the same double standard as with Article 42.7. They're called to die for the common market, but not allowed to earn from it. My God, I'm not saying it's a conspiracy, I'm talking about something else. That this is actually scarier than a conspiracy. The very mechanism of accession is set up in such a way that it locks Ukraine in a cage of rules just until the free market has had a chance to make it strong, so that, God forbid, Ukraine doesn't come back to life. No one signs an order, it's just that all the Western players benefit from this, and those who make the decisions don't have any principle that would stop them. And finally, the most subtle point. Israel seems to be from a completely different world, and elections are happening in Israel, and what should be shocking is happening, but it hardly surprises anyone anymore. Everyone is interfering in the internal affairs of this small country at the same time. Part of the American Democratic Party, the structure of the European Union, and yes, Russia. Russia, which according to reports is trying to bribe, buy off, and persuade Russian-speaking voters in Israel not to vote for the current prime minister and his ally. And suddenly these three have a common goal, to remove one person. But why him specifically? Let's call things by their proper names, because he is helping the main evil. An evil for Russia, for Ukraine, for the European Union, for the globalists, and for the progressives. And for, I don't know what it's called, the one who's into climate, the climatist, excuse my expression, Trump. And that's why he's hated in Moscow, and among some of the Ukrainian diaspora in the US and in Brussels offices. Those who can't agree on anything among themselves instantly find common ground as soon as it comes to deciding whom to bring down. First Trump, then Yuriev. Everyone quickly comes to an agreement. Here it is, the final touch to our portrait. People and forces without a common principle are incapable of building anything together. But they can easily tear something down together. Creation requires a map.
Разрушение.
Destruction needs only a hammer. Enough common hatred. Let's gather everything we've just seen into one palm. Russia and Ukraine who can't make peace. Kasparov, Karamurza who can't work together. Refugees who don't know where to run. The Kremlin, which makes up its own numbers. They deceive everyone, how much they have and what they have. Europe, which takes away from its nurses and signs up to go to war. Everyone is putting pressure on Israel at the same time. The reason is that no one has any principles. No principles means no leader. There are only those who are drawn to where the money is, the cash, the power, or just what's familiar and pleasant. And people without principles can only do one thing: quarrel and destroy. It turns out that even enemies stick together. Alliances are collapsing and former friends are rebelling. That's our era summed up in one phrase. And now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. In every news story that follows, you'll recognize the same things, the same features, the same pattern. But I promised you at the beginning that I wouldn't end with fear. This grim picture has a very bright flip side. There's a very bright flip side. Unlike the moon, whose far side, they say, I haven't seen it myself, isn't warm. If everything that's falling apart before your eyes is falling apart for one reason, then it can be treated with one remedy. Neither 100 reforms nor a new leader with a loud microphone is the answer. The worldview is the principle, from which you can evaluate every decision without waiting for it to collapse. And this principle doesn't need to be invented. It was discovered long ago and is just waiting to be adopted. Hillel gave us a rule: do not do to others what is hateful to you. Galambus explained why this is not just a kind wish, but a law on which our civilization stands. My life, my thoughts, my will are my property, and yours are yours. If you don't interfere and don't encroach on mine, I won't encroach on yours. Berdyaev said that freedom is not a crowd of equals, but the dignity of each individual person. Well, also, excuse me, of course, but two more quotes, so to speak. Bear with me. Milton said 400 years ago, "Let truth and falsehood meet in open debate, and who has ever seen truth lose?" Well, so to speak, in open debate and so on, Mill added this last point to it. The only limit a free person needs is this: don't harm others and otherwise live. You see, it's all essentially the same thing, just worded differently. Here's your card. They don't have it, but you, I really hope, after these 30 minutes already do. And that's our advantage. Because a person with a map doesn't panic in the fog, he doesn't run blindly, he doesn't sell his vote for a grant, he doesn't sign someone else's war, he doesn't join the crowd in pressuring the one the crowd was told not to like. He stands his ground because he's no longer part of the crowd, he's an individual, he stands calmly because he knows where he stands. He understands that any proposal, any law, any idea that requires taking something from someone without their permission is a bad idea, a bad law. And we, those who understand this, will stand firm to make sure this doesn't happen. Even if we take away from one, we will benefit 1,000,000. It's still a bad idea because it will lead us exactly to where we are now. Because it's a step in that direction, then another little step, then another little step, very small, justified. And it leads to theft, to banditry, to deception, and to the complete lack of accountability of the authorities, which we are seeing now here in the US. By the way, I think that things are happening much worse and on a larger scale in other countries around the world. A world that keeps quarreling will eventually get tired of fighting, and then the winner won't be the loudest one, but the one who holds the map. I want that to be you. That's why I'm doing what I'm doing. Of the immediate things, we're already at the end. Don't fall for Putin's attempts, the EU Democrat, to separate Israel from America. Today, Netanyahu's coalition must stand firm. Ukrainians, do you understand that if they give you so many billions of euros, it's for something? They want something from you. And do you know what they want from you? Ukrainians, they're offering you so much money. I know, because I would never vote for that mountain of cheese they're offering you completely free of charge. And Europeans, don't you see that you're being dragged into a world war? And why do you need that? And who needs that? Maybe it's needed by those to whom you entrusted power, and now they need to cover their tracks. Or maybe China needs it. But accepting Ukraine into the European Union while it's at war would automatically make Europe a party to the war. What does that mean? Why the war?
Why? It would be like death for Europe in every sense of the word. And it's not about Russia defeating you. You have 550 million people. It would be like death.
Or is it about all the problems you will now have? They won't be about Russia. They'll go back to the war, and not about what those filthy creatures did to you, and the scoundrels who claimed they were protecting the poor by taking from the rich. Well, you filthy ones are all over Europe. What do you think? They were paying off. And now they've already brought Europe to a state where it's practically a finished continent. Maybe, but there will really be a huge amount of blood because of this. Only I'm afraid that after all this blood, things will get even worse. You can also see that great civilizations disappeared before the European civilization appeared. And now, by the same rules, it's going down as well. If it's important for you not just to learn the news, but to understand the mechanism behind it, I have two paths for you, and I ask you to check out both. So this channel is my daily analysis, at least one video every day, often a second one, sometimes an interview as the second video on other channels, news and analysis. For everyone who wants to see the bigger picture behind the headlines, subscribe right here so you don't miss any of them. Because, well, as you saw today, everything is connected. A missing link changes the whole picture. So hit the bell as hard as you can. And if you're one of those who likes to think deeply, down to the very root, come to the Roadmap to Freedom. It's a separate channel. There, twice a week, we don't just skim over events, but go down to the very foundation. What is property? What is freedom? Why do unions collapse? And how are those built that last for centuries? This is for the few, but I think you might be one of them. If you've listened to the end, you might be one of them. Subscribe to both, one to know what's happening and the other to understand why. And together they give you something that none of the heroes of our story have today, a complete picture. Take care of yourself and protect your ability to think independently. This is an incredibly rare and valuable asset on Earth. Until we meet again, goodbye, and I hope you have a wonderful day.